The smell of roasted chicken filled my house that night. It had been years since I'd cooked something special, but my daughter was coming over, and she wasn't coming alone. "Dad, I'm bringing someone special tonight," she'd said earlier that day. "His name's Carlos. You're going to love him." Her excitement warmed me, though something in her tone made my stomach twist. Grace had always been my light, my only family since her mother passed away. I'd watched her grow from a curious little girl into a strong, ambitious woman. But as any father knows, no matter how old your daughter gets, she will always be your little girl. So, I wanted this night to be perfect. I cleaned the house, set the good plates, polished the old silverware, even lit candles, something I hadn't done since her mother's funeral. When the doorbell finally rang, I wiped my hands and opened the door. Carlos stood there, smiling like a man used to being admired. He was tall, handsome, and confident in that way that's just a little too much. A bouquet of red roses in one hand, a bottle of expensive wine in the other. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his cologne strong, his suit sharp enough to cut glass. "Senor Miller." He greeted me with a firm handshake, his accent smooth and practiced. "It's an honor to meet you." "Please," I said, forcing a smile, "call me John." Grace appeared from behind him, radiant and full of life. "Dad, this is Carlos," she said proudly. "He's from Miami, but his family's originally from Madrid. You both love Spain. You'll have so much to talk about." Spain. I couldn't help but smile at that. She didn't know I'd lived there for almost 10 years after college, teaching English and falling in love with her mother, a local artist with a fiery soul. Spanish wasn't just a language I knew, it was part of who I was. But I didn't tell Carlos that. I wanted to see who he really was when he thought no one understood. We sat at the dining table, the candles flickering between us. He complimented the meal, the decor, the wine. His words were smooth, maybe too smooth. There was something calculated in his charm. Grace seemed so happy, laughing at every joke, glowing with pride. I stayed quiet, just watching, observing. Then, after a few glasses of wine, he turned to her and said something softly in Spanish. "Tu padre parece amable, pero está atrapado en el pasado." Grace laughed awkwardly, glancing at me. I didn't move, didn't blink. "Your father seems nice, but he's stuck in the past." He thought I didn't understand. That was his first mistake. He kept slipping Spanish phrases into the conversation, every time thinking he was clever. "Está tan calado," he said later with a smirk. "Seguro que no entiende lo que digo." He's so quiet. I bet he doesn't even understand what I'm saying. I smiled faintly, cutting another slice of chicken, letting the silence hang. My silence was my weapon. I'd learned long ago that arrogant men reveal more when they think you're not listening. Grace didn't notice the tone behind his words. She was too busy being in love. I didn't want to ruin her night. So, I stayed calm, patient, careful. I'd seen this kind of man before. Smooth talker, good looks, all charm and ambition, but no soul. And then, as the wine started to work on him, he leaned closer to Grace, his voice dropping to a whisper he thought I couldn't catch. "Es amable, pero viejo. Cuando muera, todo esto será nuestro." The words hit me like a punch. He's kind, but old. When he dies, all of this will be ours. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. I didn't move, didn't speak. I stared at the candle flame and counted my breaths. The man was sitting in my home, eating my food, drinking my wine, and talking about my death as if it were a business plan. My daughter smiled at him, unaware of the venom he was spewing. I wanted to explode, to stand up, to throw him out, to tell Grace exactly what he'd said. But then, I heard my late wife's voice in my head. "Don't act on anger. Listen. Wait. Then strike when they least expect it." I swallowed hard and forced a smile. "Would you like some dessert, Carlos?" I asked calmly. He looked startled for a second, maybe worried I'd understood. Then his smirk returned. "Of course, sir. Whatever you've made." I stood and walked to the kitchen, whispering quietly to myself in Spanish. "Vamos a ver quién entiende quién." Let's see who really understands who. I served the pie, pretending nothing was wrong. He kept talking about his business, some marketing company in Miami, investors in Madrid, big opportunities. Every word reeked of ego. Grace listened like every syllable was gospel. I nodded politely, studying him. He dropped subtle hints about finances, about how family assets should be properly managed. Every hint was a test, to see how much I'd reveal, how much of my wealth he could one day control. After dinner, Grace helped me clean while Carlos scrolled on his phone, barely pretending to offer help. "You raised an amazing daughter," he said, still looking at his screen. "You must be proud." "I am," I said. "More than you know." When they left, Grace hugged me tight. "What do you think, Dad? Isn't he wonderful?" I hesitated. "He's confident," I said. She smiled, not catching the pause in my tone. The door closed, and silence filled the house again. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty hallway. Then I went to my study and opened my laptop. I typed his name, Carlos Velasquez, into the search bar. It didn't take long. Social media profiles, flashy photos, expensive cars, business ventures that didn't add up. The deeper I looked, the darker it got. Lawsuits, shady partnerships, fake charities, and women. Lots of women. Photos of him smiling with different faces, each one newer, younger. My stomach turned. Grace had no idea who she was dealing with. I sat back in my chair, staring at his picture on the screen. That smug smile. The same one he wore at my table. The same one he used when he mocked me. He thought he was untouchable. He thought I was too old to matter. He was wrong. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker outside, my reflection faint in the glass. My heart was heavy, not with anger, but with purpose. I knew what I had to do. I had spent a lifetime being quiet, respectful, patient. But sometimes silence isn't peace, it's preparation. I thought of my wife, of what she would say if she were still here. Protect her, I imagined her whispering. Even if she doesn't understand now. And I would. I would protect Grace from this man, even if she hated me for it. Carlos believed that Spanish was his secret, that he could hide behind it, and I'd never notice. But I'd lived too many years among men like him, smooth on the surface, rotten underneath. I taught students like him, talked to con artists like him, buried friends because of men like him. I stood, poured the last of the wine, and raised my glass to the empty chair across from me. "Here's to you, Carlos," I muttered under my breath. "You have no idea what's coming." Because I wasn't just some old man he could outsmart. I understood every word he said. And soon, I'd make him understand every consequence. That night, I planned the first step of his downfall. Quietly, patiently, in the same language he used to humiliate me. I began the next morning like a man reborn. The sun came through the curtains weak and forgiving. But inside me the world had sharpened into particular edges. Grace was still out, probably at work or with Carlos. The house was mine for the first uninterrupted hours since that dinner. I made coffee the way I always had, strong, black, the smell grounding, and sat at the kitchen table with the laptop open, the photograph of my wife propped against the sugar jar like a quiet guardian. I could have called Grace, told her everything, and watched the outrage spill from her like a waterfall. I could have marched to their apartment that afternoon, shoved the truth into her chest, and let it fester. But emotion had shown me its limits the night before. Anger makes mistakes. Revenge, if it's to be meaningful, must be precise. His humiliation needed to be public, undeniable, and irreversible. It had to cut through the nonsense he used to dress himself up as dignity. And it had to be in Spanish, the language he used as a blade. I opened a new document and started a list. The first item was evidence. Men like Carlos live by impressions. They are careful curators of image. And behind the curtain are patterns, financial threads, social circles, old girlfriends, quiet legal headaches. The internet, I reminded myself, is a ledger that never quite forgets. You only need to know where to look. I spent the day digging. His name, his middle name, the city he listed on LinkedIn, every variation of search terms. It was like unraveling a knot. A LinkedIn profile listed a company that had changed names twice in as many years. A charity page had a donation drive with a name that matched nothing else. There, the address led to a mailbox service. Old news clippings hinted at a lawsuit that had been settled amicably. Photos on Instagram showed him laughing in expensive restaurants with different women, each caption more flattering than the last. I printed things, dozens of pages, and spread them across the dining table like evidence in a courtroom. I drank another cup of coffee and put on my reading glasses. The more I looked, the clearer his pattern became. Charm, fake networks, promises of shared futures presented as business plans, women who seemed useful at a moment and dispensable the next. There were small things I felt ashamed I hadn't noticed before. how he asked about who handled the household accounts, how casually he mentioned consolidating assets. You don't say that unless you want control. I needed allies. There were two kinds I considered: those who could help me gather legal documentation and those who could pull the curtain down in front of an audience. For legal, I called an old acquaintance from the neighborhood, Miguel, who used to act as a translator for our community clinic. Miguel had a sharp mind and a stubborn streak that matched mine. For public exposure, I thought about the engagement party they would surely plan. A family celebration would be the most populous stage in which to make a revelation. But I would not expose Grace to humiliation. She must remain the hurt party who then understood and forgave, or, at the very least, saw the truth cleanly. So whatever public scene I arranged, it had to be directed at Carlos alone, not at my daughter. Miguel agreed to meet that afternoon. He arrived with a thermos of coffee and a skepticism I admired. "You look like a man with a plan," he said, scooping from my kettle as if the world was still ordinary. I showed him the printouts. He read quickly, his eyebrows knitting. "This is more than bragging," he muttered in Spanish. "This is pattern work. You have names, dates, photos. But we need something immediate, something that ties him to the lies he tells in private." "What about the fiancé dinner?" I asked. He spoke plainly in Spanish last night. He thinks his words are safe when he switches language. I need something that proves his intent, something he says that can't be written off. Miguel tapped the table thoughtfully. "You can record him. But two problems: local laws about recording and the setting. You're allowed to record your private conversations if one party consents. You were there. But public shame? We must be careful. If he sues and claims defamation, he could bury it." He glanced up at me. "You want him gone. Do not build a case that collapses because of poor evidence." I nodded. I had thought about code, cameras, clandestine audio, but I had not considered the small legal traps. Miguel's caution steadied me. "Okay," I said. "Records, then. I'll get him on tape saying the things he thinks are private. I'll collect his financial ties. Then when the time comes, I'll present everything, publicly, in the right place, with the right witnesses." We made a plan. Miguel would call a contact at a local investigative firm. Nothing criminal, he assured me. Just an inquiry that could verify corporate registration, past lawsuits, and whether a charity actually existed. Meanwhile, I would bait Carlos, gently, like a fisherman testing a line. I'd keep the invitation to another dinner, a small family gathering with only a few close people. Me, Grace, Carlos, and one or two friends who knew how to keep a calm face in a storm. That evening I made a list of questions, harmless on the surface but designed to dislodge his mask. Each question required answers, and he loved to answer. "How do you plan to help Grace in her career? What are your long-term investment ideas?" I would steer the conversation, let him talk, and when his arrogance slipped into specificity, business names, partner names, dates, those were the details I could use. Over the next 2 days, Miguel called and texted, returning with small victories. A shell company tied to Carlos's name had an address linked to a mailbox in a strip mall. The charity he touted had never been registered as a nonprofit. A civil suit in another state bore his name as a consultant for a venture that had collapsed with little explanation. The trail was not a neat line, but a messy web. That was better. Messiness made people less likely to hide. I also reached out to a former neighbor of Carlos's, a woman named Elena who had worked with him at a small marketing outfit in Miami. I messaged her in Spanish, carefully polite, never mentioning my intentions. She responded quickly, with guarded warmth. She remembered Carlos as charming and ambitious, but said something else that caught my attention. "He always talks about family money." He said once, "People have what they deserve, and sometimes you have to take it in the name of love." Her words read like a confession without the formalities. I asked if she would speak with me by phone. She hesitated, then agreed. When Elena called, I let her speak. She told me about promises that had turned into demands, small manipulations that escalated when he thought he was winning. She agreed to give me copies of messages and a few photos. Nothing illegal, she insisted, but enough to show pattern. I thanked her and promised discretion. She sounded relieved. People who had been played often longed to be on the side of truth. They wanted their part in ending the cycle. Meanwhile, I kept my face neutral around Grace. She called me twice that week, the way she always did, short and bright, a life full of work and weekend plans. I did not mention the investigation. Fathers protect. Sometimes protection means silence. If Grace smelled intrusion in the way I moved, she didn't say so. Love, I reminded myself, can be a blinding light. My job was to lower that light just enough that she could see the shadows. I arranged the dinner for Saturday. I told Grace it would be a small family meal to celebrate her recent promotion. She was delighted and immediately suggested a few people to invite. I gently narrowed the list to one close friend of hers, someone whose calmness could anchor the room, and Miguel, who agreed to be there as a neighborly presence. In truth, Miguel's role was both man and watchful eye. He had agreed to take notes, discreetly, and help me identify the exact moment Carlos slipped. On the day of the dinner, I dressed carefully. I wore the dark sweater Grace always liked and a shirt pressed for dignity. When Carlos arrived, he looked polished, unsurprised. He greeted me with the same measured charm, as if my last attempt to discover him had been merely an interesting game. He did not know that Elena's photos were on my desk, not yet in the right hands, but present in thought. He did not know that Miguel would be there to pick up on the rhythm of his lies. And he did not know that I had placed a small digital recorder by the centerpiece, subtle, disguised as part of the decor. It was legal. I had put it there myself. We ate. Conversation began on safe topics: work, food, the city's weather. Grace laughed, radiant and unsuspecting. I watched Carlos closely. He was relaxed, his smile more confident as the wine flowed. Eventually, like a man unspooling his own rope, he slipped. He talked about security and legacy, words he favored like coins he loved to throw. He mentioned an investor meeting in Miami next month, specific names, dates, and an email contact for a partner. He spoke about streamlining family properties with a certainty that made my skin crawl. Miguel scribbled in shorthand, his face betraying nothing. At one point, Carlos laughed and said in Spanish, perhaps thinking it was private, "No hay que preocuparse por papa, él no entiende. Cuando si el momento, todo será nuestro." No need to worry about Dad. He doesn't understand. When the time comes, everything will be ours. His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone rehearsed in contempt. The recorder sat between the roses, its tiny light hidden by a shadow. My pulse remained steady. I did not rise, did not scold. I let him imagine himself clever. When dessert arrived, I stood to refill the coffee, and on impulse, I asked about his family, about his grandparents, where in Madrid they lived. That was a test of empathy and roots, two things he pretended to have. He smiled and told a story of a seaside town and a childhood filled with siestas and soccer. Details spilled, the kind men make up to make themselves larger. After dessert, as the plates were cleared, I excused myself to the study purportedly to fetch a photo album. In reality, I wanted to check the recorder. I listened to the first minutes on the small device and felt a cold satisfaction. There it was, his voice saying what he had said in my kitchen, clear and unambiguous. He had given me the words I needed. But words alone were not victory. I needed corroboration, documents, messages, connections. I placed a call to Miguel and asked him to follow up on the partner email Carlos had mentioned. If it's the same shell company, I said, we'll have the ties we need. Miguel's reply was brief and resolute. I'll have something by morning. That night, I did not sleep much. I lay awake, going over every small conversation, every calculated smile. My mind mapped possible outcomes: a quiet settlement, a legal entanglement, the slow grind of courtrooms where truth can be worn down by lawyers and time. None of those felt like justice. I wanted something cleaner, something that settled the ledger in a single, unavoidable way. The public humiliation had to be at a moment when others would witness it, and when Carlos could not rewrite what had been said. I drafted a second, riskier plan then. One that would use the words he had spoken, the contacts we were uncovering, and the very language he had used as his weapon. It would require patience, the cooperation of Elena and Miguel, and the nerve to stand in front of family, neighbors, and perhaps a few curious onlookers, and play him back in his own voice, while simultaneously revealing the web he had spun. It would humiliate him in plain sight, with audio and documents that matched. And because it would be in Spanish, the sting would be personal and unmistakable. I knew the risks. There could be backlash. Grace could resent me for orchestrating such a scene. But I also knew how easily a life can be stolen by a man who has practiced taking what he wants. She deserved to know the truth in a way that left no room for doubt. She deserved to see the man she loved stripped of his mask, not by rumor or accusation, but by what he had said and what he had done. The next morning, Miguel called with confirmation. The partner email led to a company registered under a name that matched an address Elena had recognized. There were invoices with Carlos's initials, payments to unknown accounts. It was a messy tapestry of transactions that suggested a repeated pattern of taking, financial moves cloaked as legitimate business. We now had both voice and paper. I arranged the timeline in my head like a surgeon preparing an incision. We would wait for a family event, something simple, a brunch perhaps, where neighbors would be present and where Grace's friends might join. I would play a recording of Carlos's Spanish remarks and present the documents side by side. The evidence would speak faster and truer than any accusation I could make in anger. There would be witnesses, proof, and the humiliation would be his alone. The plan felt righteous and terrible at once. I did not enjoy the thought of engineered misery, but I loved my daughter more than the temporary discomfort of someone who had earned a public reckoning. I rehearsed what I would say to Grace beforehand. Calm, factual, and protective. I rehearsed how I would present the proof. And under it all, like the slow beat of a drum, I kept the vow I had whispered to the empty chair. This would be in Spanish. He had used that language as cloak and dagger. He would now find it a mirror. There was one more thing to do before the trap could be sprung. Make sure Grace's mother's memory remained a steady light, not a weapon. I found her favorite song and left it soft and playing on the old record player, a small comfort for a house full of plans. For what we were about to do would not be without cost. Truth rarely is. And yet, when I folded the printouts and slid them into a manila folder that night, I felt a calmness I had not known in years. The world was messy, but so was justice. The two could meet in the middle if one had patience, cunning, and an old man's stubborn love. The invitation went out 2 weeks later. Grace was radiant when she told me she'd set the engagement brunch at my house. It felt more intimate, she said, more family. Perfect. Carlos, predictably, was delighted to be the center of attention again. He spoke of photographers and decorations, of how elegance meant reputation. I nodded through it all, knowing every word, every detail, would lead him toward the same table where he had mocked me. The difference this time was that I would no longer be the quiet old man pretending not to understand. In those 2 weeks, Miguel worked like a shadow. Elena sent over the files, email exchanges, receipts, a few photos with timestamps that matched his supposed business trips. They painted a picture of manipulation so complete that even I, hardened as I was, felt sick. Carlos was stealing from companies, lying to investors, draining people's trust as if it were a bank account. My daughter's heart was just one more deposit to him. I printed everything, organized it into a binder, and locked it in my desk. On my phone, I stored the recording, his voice saying, "When the time comes, everything will be ours." Each time I replayed it, my pulse steadied. Not from rage anymore, but from clarity. He would destroy himself. I would simply hold up the mirror. The morning of the brunch was bright, almost cruelly so. I wore a light gray suit, the same one from Grace's graduation. It smelled faintly of cedar from the closet. I cooked again, the same roasted chicken, though this time with quiet hands and no nervous tremor. Grace helped arrange the flowers. Carlos arrived half an hour early, wearing that flawless grin. "Senor Miller," he said warmly, "you've outdone yourself again. This is beautiful." I smiled back. "Thank you, Carlos. I thought you'd enjoy a familiar atmosphere." Guests arrived, friends, neighbors, Miguel among them, his expression unreadable. The laughter filled the room easily. Grace moved like sunlight through the crowd, greeting everyone with warmth. Carlos basked in her glow, shaking hands, performing charm like a showman. I poured wine, answered small talk, waited. Finally, when everyone had eaten and plates were half empty, Grace raised her glass. "To love," she said, "to family, and to new beginnings." The room clinked with applause. Carlos stood, slipping an arm around her waist. "And to my beautiful fiancée," he added, voice rich with pride, "whose father has welcomed me like his own." I felt the irony press against my ribs. I stood as well, clearing my throat. "I'd like to say a few words," I began. The room quieted. Grace smiled, expecting something sentimental. Carlos smiled, too, confident, unaware. I've always believed family means honesty, I said slowly. So when we welcome someone into it, we must see them for who they truly are. Not the image they present, but the person behind it. Carlos shifted slightly, his smile thinning. I reached into my pocket and placed my phone on the table. Before I continue, I want to share something. A short clip from our last dinner together. Grace looked puzzled. Dad, what? The sound filled the room. Carlos's unmistakable voice, speaking in Spanish. He's kind, but old. When he dies, all this will be ours. The words hung in the air like smoke. Gasps rippled through the guests. Grace's face drained of color. Carlos's glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the floor. That's not, he stammered, switching to English. You misunderstood. I cut him off, switching languages smoothly for the first time in front of him. No, Carlos. Te entendí perfectamente. I understood every word. My voice was calm, steady, carrying decades of unspoken strength. The room went dead silent. You see, I continued in Spanish, every syllable deliberate. I lived in Madrid for 10 years. My late wife was Spanish. And every insult you whispered in my house, every greedy word you spoke thinking I couldn't hear, I understood. Grace's hand covered her mouth. Carlos's mask began to crack. He looked around the room, faces staring, judging, then back at me. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, now angry, his accent sharper. Oh, but I do, I replied, switching back to English. I opened the binder and laid out the documents, screenshots, bank statements, photographs, printed emails. This is who you are, Carlos. Not a loving fiancé, not a businessman, a liar, a thief, and a predator. He reached forward, trying to grab the papers, but Miguel was faster. He placed a firm hand on Carlos's shoulder, pushing him gently but decisively back into his chair. You should sit, Miguel said quietly. I turned to Grace. I didn't want to ruin your happiness, sweetheart. I wanted you to see the truth for yourself. Carlos's voice broke into anger. You had no right to spy on me. This is manipulation. I leaned forward, my voice low but cutting. You humiliated me in my own home, in front of my daughter, in a language you thought made you superior. I returned the favor, in the language we both understand. The language of truth. The guests whispered. Grace's friend began gathering her things, unwilling to stay in the storm. Grace stood frozen, trembling. Then she whispered, Is it true? Carlos didn't answer. His silence was the loudest confession of all. She turned to me, eyes filled with tears. You knew? I found out, I said softly. I needed you to see it. Not because I wanted revenge, but because you deserve better than a man who saw you as property. She nodded faintly, her body stiff with realization. Then she pulled off her engagement ring and set it on the table. Get out, she said. Her voice was small but final. Carlos opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked around one last time. No allies left, no escape. Then he walked out, his footsteps echoing through the quiet. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Miguel raised his glass. To truth, he said quietly. I nodded, though my hands shook slightly. When the guests left, Grace sat beside me on the couch, silent. I thought she might yell, cry, demand to know everything. Instead, she leaned her head on my shoulder. You understood him the whole time, she whispered. I did, I said. And now, so do you. We sat like that until the sun began to fade. The house felt heavy, but for the first time in years, honest. My revenge hadn't been loud. It hadn't needed to be. I didn't destroy Carlos with violence or rage. I let his own words do it for me. Later that night, when Grace had gone to bed, I walked into the dining room. The candles had burned low, just like that first evening. I poured myself a small glass of wine and stared at the empty chair where he had once sat. He had tried to use a language he thought belonged to him to make me small. Instead, I'd used it to make him seen. That was the difference between cruelty and justice. Outside, the wind picked up. The world went on, quiet and unbothered. I sat there for a long time, the glow of the candles flickering across the old wooden table. Somewhere deep inside, a piece of me settled, not in triumph, but in peace. Because sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone. It's about restoring what they tried to take: dignity, truth, love. And tonight, I had taken all of that back. The next morning, sunlight crept through the blinds as if nothing had happened, but the house carried a new kind of silence. It wasn't empty anymore, it was cleansed. The night before had left the air heavy with truth, and though it hurt, it also freed something inside me. The lie was gone. Carlos was gone. But I knew it wasn't over. Men like him didn't vanish quietly. They crawled in the dark, licking their wounds, looking for someone else to blame. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the steam curl in the morning light. Grace hadn't come out of her room yet. I could hear her pacing upstairs, the faint sound of footsteps, the pauses that told me she was crying. I wanted to go to her, to tell her she'd done the right thing, but I also knew she needed to feel this pain. To understand that love built on deception is not love at all. The knock on the door came around 10. When I opened it, Miguel stood there, holding a small folder. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp. "He's already trying to fix his image," he said, stepping inside. I checked his online accounts. He deleted photos, locked down profiles, and posted something vague about betrayal. Typical behavior of a man exposed. I nodded slowly. "He'll blame me," I said. Miguel gave a short, humorless laugh. "Of course. You took away his mask. Men like that can't survive without one." Grace came downstairs then. Her eyes were red, her hair messy, her voice quiet but steady. "Morning," she said. I couldn't sleep. I poured her coffee and placed it in front of her. She didn't touch it. "Did he try to contact you?" I asked. She nodded. "He called 3 times. Texted. Said you misunderstood everything. That he was joking. That it was all taken out of context." Her lip trembled. "He even said you edited that recording." I felt a cold anger rise, but I forced it down. "And what do you believe?" Grace met my eyes, and for the first time, I saw strength behind her tears. "I believe my father." I exhaled slowly, letting that sentence settle between us. Miguel gave a quiet nod, approving. Still, I knew Carlos wasn't done. A man like that doesn't disappear. He schemes. That afternoon, I called an old lawyer friend from my teaching years in Spain, Roberto. He owed me a favor, and he still practiced international law. I sent him copies of the documents Miguel and I had collected. By evening, he called back. "Your instincts were right," he said in his crisp Castilian accent. "This man has been involved in 3 different shell corporations. He's moved money between them to hide transactions. It's not just immoral, it's criminal. I'll file a formal report with the authorities. Quietly, they'll start looking into it within the week." "Gracias, Roberto," I said. "This isn't just about me. It's about making sure he can't hurt anyone else." That night, Grace came into my study. She looked exhausted but calm. "I've been thinking," she said. "You always told me Mom believed people show who they are when they think no one's watching." I smiled faintly. She did. "You were watching," Grace whispered. "And you saw it before I did." She stepped closer and hugged me, long and tight, the way she hadn't since she was a child. "Thank you for not giving up on me." I held her without speaking. Some things don't need words. For the next few days, life returned in slow waves. I went back to my routine, coffee, reading, walking in the park. Grace stayed with me, taking a break from work, rediscovering the quiet she had forgotten. Sometimes, we cooked together. Sometimes, we sat in silence. There was healing in both. But peace never lasts long when someone's pride is wounded. On the 5th day, a black car parked across the street. I noticed it because I notice everything now. It stayed there for hours, engine off, windows dark. When I stepped outside to get the mail, the driver started the engine and drove away. No plates visible. That was the confirmation I didn't want but expected. That evening, I told Grace to stay inside and lock the doors. "It's probably nothing," I said, though we both knew it was something. Miguel came over again, his hand instinctively resting near his jacket pocket. A gesture of caution more than threat. "If he's watching, it means he's desperate," Miguel said. "Men like him always want to control the story. You took that away. He'll want it back." I looked out the window at the empty street. "Then let him try," I said. "He doesn't know who he's dealing with anymore." The following morning, I received an email. No sender, no signature, just a single line written in Spanish. "Esto no ha terminado, viejo." "This isn't over, old man." I smiled when I read it. Because he was wrong. It was over. Just not in the way he imagined. 2 days later, Roberto called again. "They've traced the accounts," he said. "Interpol has opened a file." If your Carlos tries to leave the country, they'll stop him. You've done the right thing, John. I thanked him, though my satisfaction was quiet. I didn't need to see him punished to feel justice. His punishment was already in motion, his name stained, his lies exposed, his reputation collapsing piece by piece. Grace started packing her things that weekend. I think I'll move back here for a while, she said. Just until I figure out what's next. I smiled softly. You'll always have a place here. That night, after she went to bed, I stepped outside. The air was cool, the moon half hidden behind clouds. The street was still. I stood there for a long time, the same spot where I'd once watched her drive away with him. Only this time, the silence wasn't loneliness, it was victory. A car passed in the distance, its headlights briefly lighting the old oak tree. I looked up at it and thought of my wife. We did it, I whispered. She's safe now. For the first time in years, I felt light. Not younger, not reborn, just unburdened. I went back inside, closed the door, and turned off the lights. The world outside could keep spinning, full of deceit and noise. But in this small house, filled with honesty and peace, I had everything I'd ever needed. And as I climbed the stairs, I realized something I hadn't before. Revenge isn't always the end of a story. Sometimes, it's the beginning of healing. For weeks, life seemed almost normal again. Grace settled into a quiet rhythm at home, helping me in the garden, cooking, spending evenings watching old movies her mother used to love. We didn't talk much about Carlos anymore. It hung in the air between us, like smoke that refused to clear, but we were learning to breathe through it. I thought it was over. I thought the silence meant peace. But I was wrong. It started with a letter. No return address, no sender, just my name written in an impatient scrawl. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of Grace leaving her office, taken from across the street. On the back, written in Spanish, were 5 words, Ella no puede esconder siempre. She can't hide forever. I felt my stomach turn cold. For a few moments, I just stood there, the paper trembling in my hands. I'd known men like him before, the kind who believe power is in control, not in truth. He was spiraling now, stripped of his image, and dangerous. I didn't tell Grace. Not yet. I called Miguel instead. Within an hour, he was at my door, scanning the photo under the kitchen light. He's watching again, Miguel said quietly. He's desperate, John. When men like this lose everything, they don't go after money. They go after pride. He won't touch her, I said firmly. Not while I'm still breathing. Miguel gave a grim smile. Then we make sure he knows that. That night, we drove through the neighborhood, watching, waiting. The streets were empty, washed in the orange glow of streetlights. At the corner near the old bookstore, I saw it. A dark sedan, the same model that had lingered weeks ago. I didn't approach. I just stood across the street, under the light, and stared directly at the windshield. Whoever was inside didn't move. I stayed there, silent, steady, until the car finally started and drove off. The next morning, Grace noticed the dark circles under my eyes. You didn't sleep, she said softly. Too much coffee, I lied. But the truth was, I couldn't rest knowing that Snake was still slithering in the shadows. A few days later, Roberto called again from Madrid. He's trying to run, he said. The investigation scared him. He wired money through multiple accounts yesterday. Small transfers, but enough to flag him. They're watching him now. Don't worry. He won't get far. But I wasn't worried about him running. I was worried about him returning. That fear became reality 2 nights later. I came home from the grocery store to find the gate open. Just slightly, enough that it didn't seem forced, but wrong enough for my instincts to spark. Inside, the living room window was cracked open, the curtains fluttering in the cold wind. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was broken. But on the dining table, there was a half-empty glass of wine. My wine. And beside it, his ring. I froze. My hands went cold as I reached for it. The gold band gleamed faintly under the lamp. On the inside, engraved in small letters, was his name, Carlos. It wasn't just a threat. It was a message. He had been inside my house. I called Miguel immediately. Within 20 minutes, he and a local officer arrived. The cop was young, polite, skeptical. No signs of forced entry, he said. Could have been left open. You sure you locked up? I'm sure, I said flatly. And that ring wasn't here before. Miguel stepped in. You're talking about a man under international investigation. He's unstable. He's not just trespassing. He's taunting. The officer took notes and promised to increase patrols. It was something, but not enough. I knew that if Carlos wanted to make me afraid, he'd failed. All he'd done was remind me who I was before life turned quiet. A man who didn't flinch when others tried to intimidate him. That night, I loaded the old revolver I'd kept locked in a drawer since my wife's passing. I wasn't planning to use it. Just having it there steadied me. Grace didn't know. She couldn't. Over the next few days, the tension coiled tighter. I noticed small things. The faint smell of cigarette smoke outside my window, footprints by the backyard gate, a car idling a block away at odd hours. Every instinct told me he was circling again, desperate for control. Then, on a Thursday evening, he finally made his move. It was raining, the kind of slow, relentless rain that makes the world blur. Grace was upstairs, talking on the phone. I was in my study, sorting old papers, when I heard the back door creak. It wasn't the wind. The hinge made a sound I knew too well, a slow metallic sigh. I stood up, silent, every sense sharpening. Then I saw him. Carlos. Standing halfway in the doorway, soaked from the rain, eyes wild. The charm was gone. He looked smaller somehow, thinner, desperate. Get out, I said quietly. He smiled, the corners of his lips twitching. You think you won, viejo? You ruined my life. I didn't move. You ruined your own. He stepped closer, dripping water on the hardwood floor. She'll come back to me. You think you can keep her from me? You can't. Grace knows the truth, I said evenly. That's what terrifies you. He laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. Truth, he spat. You made me look like a monster. You made me nothing. You did that yourself, I said, my voice rising for the first time. I just let everyone see it. He took another step. I reached into the drawer slowly, unseen, resting my hand on the revolver's grip. Leave, I said again. Now. For a moment, I thought he would. Then his expression shifted, rage, shame, and something broken flickered across his face. You think you can erase me? He hissed. I'll make you regret. Before he could finish, a voice shouted from the stairs. Dad, Grace. He froze. His head snapped toward her voice, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. Grace stood at the top of the stairs, pale, shaking. Carlos, she whispered. What are you doing? He stared at her, his jaw tightening, searching for the old power he once had over her, but it was gone. She wasn't the same woman who once believed him. Go, she said, her voice trembling but firm. If you ever come near us again, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life behind bars. The silence that followed was thick and unbearable. Then he laughed again, but it was weak, broken laughter. You're both pathetic, he muttered, turning toward the door. Enjoy your little victory. It won't last. He walked out into the rain, leaving muddy footprints across my floor. The door slammed behind him, echoing through the house. Grace ran down the stairs and collapsed into my arms, sobbing. I held her, stroking her hair, whispering, It's over. He's done. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't completely true. Men like him rarely go quietly. The next morning, the police found his car abandoned near the edge of town. The driver's seat was empty, the keys still inside. They searched the area for days, but there was no sign of him. Some said he fled the country. Some said worse. I never saw him again. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is dark and the wind moves through the trees, I swear I can still hear his voice, that same arrogance fading into the distance. And then I remember the look on his face when he realized the game was over. That look was enough. Because revenge, in the end, isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about survival, about showing that even the old, the quiet, the underestimated can still fight back when it matters most. And I did. For Grace. For truth. For peace. Months passed. The leaves began to fall, painting the street in colors of rust and gold. Life, little by little, began to heal. Grace went back to work, though she still lived with me for a while longer. She smiled again, cautiously at first, as if afraid the world might punish her for it. I kept busy with my garden, fixing things around the house, pretending everything was normal. But peace, I've learned, doesn't come quickly. It tiptoes in slowly, testing if it's welcome. Carlos was gone, at least physically. The police never found him. Rumors came and went. Someone saw him in Miami. Someone claimed he'd fled to South America. The official story was simple. The investigation expanded, warrants were issued, but by the time the authorities acted, he'd disappeared. For a while, that uncertainty haunted me. Every sound outside, every unfamiliar car parked too long near the house, I noticed everything. Old habits die hard. But fear, I realized, gives him power. So I stopped waiting for his shadow and started living again. One afternoon, while I was trimming the hedges, Grace came outside, holding an envelope. "It's from Madrid," she said. I wiped my hands and opened it. Inside was a short letter from Roberto, my old friend. His handwriting was neat, precise. "John, Interpol has officially closed the case. The assets have been seized, and his accounts are frozen. If he's alive, he's living without a name, without money, and without a place to hide. Justice, it seems, came quietly. R." I folded the letter slowly, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. It wasn't triumph, it was release. The man who had humiliated me, who had nearly destroyed my daughter's life, had finally faced what he'd earned. But instead of satisfaction, I just felt peace. Grace stood beside me, watching. "Is it over?" she asked. "Yes," I said softly. "For good this time." She nodded and smiled, though tears shimmered in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad. For everything. For not seeing it sooner." I put my arm around her shoulders. "Don't ever apologize for loving someone," I said. "Love isn't weakness. It's trust. The wrong person just used it against you. But that doesn't make you foolish. It makes you human." We stood there for a long time, the late afternoon light fading around us. The world had been cruel, but not irreparable. That evening, we decided to make dinner together, roasted chicken again, the way her mother used to. The same meal that had once begun everything. Only now, the table wasn't heavy with pretense. It was warm, honest, quiet. The air smelled of rosemary and forgiveness. As we ate, Grace said something that stayed with me. "You know, when I look back now, I think the real revenge wasn't the recording or the documents, or even the police. It was the way you stayed calm, the way you made him show who he really was." I smiled. "People destroy themselves when they believe they're untouchable," I said. "All you have to do is let them talk." After dinner, I went outside. The night air was cool, the stars sharp against the sky. I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, listening to the quiet hum of crickets. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel haunted. It felt alive again. I thought about my wife. I imagined her sitting beside me, that soft smile she used to wear when the world was kind. "We did it," I whispered. "She's safe now." A breeze passed through the trees, rustling the leaves like a gentle applause. Inside, Grace laughed at something on the television, a sound I hadn't heard in so long it made my chest ache. I smiled to myself. Maybe this was what victory really looked like, not fireworks or headlines, but peace in a home once filled with fear. As I sat there, I realized something deeper. Carlos's disappearance didn't matter. What mattered was that Grace had found her strength again, that I'd kept my promise, to protect her, no matter what it cost. I raised my glass to the night. "To peace," I murmured, "and to endings that finally stay ended." I thought about the man I'd been before, quiet, overlooked, the old fool he thought I was. Maybe I had been that man once. But now I knew better. Age isn't weakness. It's memory, the kind that outlasts arrogance. He used Spanish to belittle me, to hide his cruelty, and I used it to end him. Not with rage, but with truth. Some nights, when I sit by the window, I still think about the sound of his voice at that dinner table, the smug laughter, the careless cruelty. But then I remember how it ended. His silence, the disbelief, the fear in his eyes when he realized I had understood him all along. That memory doesn't bring me anger anymore. It brings me calm. Because in the end, the greatest revenge isn't destruction. It's dignity. It's walking away knowing you never stooped to their level and still won. As the clock struck midnight, I closed my eyes and listened to the soft rhythm of rain starting outside. I thought of my wife again, of Grace asleep upstairs, safe and free. And I whispered one last sentence, not in English, but in Spanish, the language that had started it all. La venganza más dulce es la paz. The sweetest revenge is peace. Then I turned off the porch light and went inside, leaving the night to carry those words away.